Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Thank you for being here tonight. How wonderful to be together again. Am I right? The fact is, our community thrives on human connection. And although I'm super proud of the last two virtual rallies, I'm aware that a virtual format can't provide a substitute for meeting face-to-face over the long run. As I often say, some of the most productive and meaningful moments at rally happen when colleagues meet in the hallways and chat over beer. And I know you'll have many of those opportunities over the next 2 days. My keynote remarks over the last 2 years have focused on the incredible challenges we have all faced during the pandemic. I did my best to acknowledge that many of us were in mourning and exhausted. I spoke of pandemic flux syndrome and the profound feeling of being unmoored and worried about the next existential shoe to drop. Tonight, I want to take a decidedly more positive tone and focus on what is going well for the land trust community. And when I talk about the problems that we continue to face, many of which are very serious, I will argue that we have reasons for optimism and power in our numbers that should compel us to take an active stance in tackling our biggest challenges. To help frame my remarks tonight, I want to share a story about some of my experiences during the pandemic. A few months into the pandemic, in the summer of 2020, my wife Elena and I took a leap that we had contemplated for years. We bought a small farm in northern Michigan. It seemed like the perfect time to do that. With travel curtailed, we could stay at home and become one with the land. And that's exactly what we did. For 14 months straight, we studied the land, we got to know its wildlife, and we experienced all the seasons. We also got busy on evenings and weekends. During our first spring, we enthusiastically improved the low-lying portion of the farm that we had decided to dedicate to wildlife habitat. First, we cleared dozens, if not hundreds, of poplar trees that had dominated the site, but unfortunately had drowned over the preceding 2 years when the Great Lakes and connected water tables had reached their all-time high water levels. Second, we eagerly participated in the local conservation district's spring sale of native plants and trees. Before we knew it, we had planted hundreds of bare root seedlings, including a number of species that are native to southern Michigan, but that are expected to soon thrive in our part of the state as the climate changes. One of those species is the swamp white oak. Now, the name gives away the main reason why we chose it. If the Great Lakes are going to periodically rise and perhaps reach new record heights, we don't want to have our forest completely reset yet again. So I'm pleased to report that a dozen or so bare root oak seedlings that we put in all survived their first Michigan winter, and they seem to be thriving this summer. But I'm also a bit embarrassed to admit that Elena and I were impatient and demanded more immediate gratification. The same spring we put in bare root plants, we also bought 2 swamp white oaks that were over 10 feet tall. They were on sale at the local native plant nursery, most likely because they had outgrown their pots. We wanted to give them a good home, but mostly we wanted to see big oak trees on our property as soon as possible. We figured that the taller trees would make that a reality much, much sooner. But unlike the bare root seedlings, the bigger trees struggled. They were root bound, they dried out quickly, and they required near constant attention from us to stay alive. Now, they're still with us today, but they look haggard and they show few signs of new growth. Instead, they seem to be focused just on surviving. Little did I know that our experiment in planting oaks provided a perfect illustration of some of the main points made by Dr. Douglas Tallamy in his 2021 book, The Nature of Oaks. If you haven't had a chance to read this book, I highly recommend it. Tallamy makes the convincing argument that oaks support more forms of life than any other tree genus in North America, and we should all be looking for opportunities to plant more of them in the landscapes that we manage. The lesson from Tallamy's book that Elena and I unintentionally confirmed is that when it comes to oaks, it's best to start small. In fact, he argues that it is ideal to start oak trees by planting acorns or bare root whips, because it allows the young oak to focus on building a massive root system that will sustain it for centuries. As he points out, a seedling oak may have up to 10 times more root mass than the biomass it shows above ground. In contrast, a large transplant is most likely going to simply sit there and struggle for years as it tries to build a root system commensurate with its size. As Talamy writes, young oak trees lay down a large root system, among the largest in the plant kingdom, which will support rapid growth and health for the rest of the oak's life. In just a few years, a young tree with an undisturbed root system will catch up with a much larger transplant or potted tree and exceed it in size. Talamy's lessons have impacted how I think about managing the natural areas of our farm. They have also caused me to reflect on our strengths as a community and how we develop those strengths. This past February, we commemorated the Land Trust Alliance's 40th anniversary, and the fact that in the fall of 1981, a small group of visionaries, at least two of whom are here tonight, convened at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and envisioned an organization that could support the growing number of land trusts that are emerging across the country. If I could ask Peter Stein and Judith Stockdale to please stand up so we can recognize they were part of that illustrious group, and we are all so grateful for all that you did at that meeting. The Land Trust Exchange was born just months later and eventually became the Land Trust Alliance, an organization that has provided so much to guide and support land trusts, including land trust standards and practices, land trust accreditation, terra firma insurance, and of course, 35 rallies. And think about how the land trust community has grown over the last 40 years and all that it's achieved. The Alliance's Land Trust Census shows that as of the end of 2020, America's land trusts have collectively conserved more than 60 million acres. That's an area larger than all the land contained in America's 63 national parks. These are lands that afford habitat for millions of plants and animals, that store and filter water, that provide sustainable timber for our homes and food for our families, that pull carbon out of the air, that help buffer against the worst effects of climate change, and that help communities across the country remain or become beautiful, welcoming places to live. This work continues now by the more than 12,000 current full and part-time staff of land trusts and their 13,000 board members. And they are supported by more than 250,000 volunteers and 6.3 million members and financial supporters. Our community started small and has grown in a steady and deliberate way, all along finding ways for land trusts to improve their operations, advocate effectively, and serve more people. We painstakingly did the hard work of building a web of connections and relationships that have sustained our organizations, built resilience, and advanced conservation. We have professionalized our field, we are striving for more inclusivity, and we are ready to help the land sector to deliver all that it can for humanity. In short, today our community is like that vibrant oak tree that is still relatively young, but has built an extensive root system and is poised to grow a massive canopy. So, what would that canopy look like? Beginning with Rally 2019, I have urged our community to rise to the challenges of the day by increasing the rate of conservation by an order of magnitude, from just over 1 million acres a year today to at least 10 million acres a year by 2030. In doing so, we can conserve another 60 million acres by 2030 and demonstrate how voluntary private land conservation is a critical part of the equation when it comes to the nation achieving its land conservation goals. But the canopy that we seek to build shouldn't be measured just by acreage. We need to focus on how many people will fit underneath it and benefit from it. Many land trusts have literally done this by protecting iconic oaks that provide inspiration and beauty for everyone living in their service territories. In doing so, these land trusts have engaged in the essence of community-centered conservation. And we as a national community must have the same ambition. The health, power, and dare I say, the legitimacy of the conservation canopy that we build out this decade will depend on whether we create an inclusive, equitable, and diverse conservation community. This is a theme that we will explore over the next 2 days of rally. So how are we going to build this canopy and reach these results? I will argue tonight that there are 3 specific things that we need to do. But before I dive into those items, I want to restart a tradition that I observed prior to the pandemic. I want to share with you my favorite road sign that I saw on my travels to visit land trusts across the country. Although I am not back to my pre-pandemic business travel schedule, I did have the opportunity to visit land trust practitioners in New York, Florida, Alaska, Montana, and Utah since the world reopened this past spring. My sincere thanks to all of you who took the time to show me your amazing work on the ground. Yet the sign of the year comes again from northern Michigan. Specifically, it comes from the drive I take to reach the almost complete conservation center of the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy. So I've chosen this sign because the 14-year-old in me still finds it very amusing, but also because it brings me to the first of the 3 topics I want to address tonight. That has you guessing, doesn't it? Well, in all seriousness, that topic is misinformation, or disinformation if you prefer. Unlike this sign, which reflects an innocent mistake, I want to talk tonight about malicious efforts to disparage private land conservation and spread falsehoods about an essential tool in our toolkit, the conservation easement. You may have noticed that I have not yet mentioned tonight the Biden administration's 30 by 30 land conservation goal for the U.S., which I speak about often. This is in part because that initiative and the very concept of 30 by 30 has been politicized in parts of the country, particularly the Intermountain West and the Plains states. The initiative is being portrayed as a governmental land grab and antithetical to private property rights. Among the tactics of those who oppose 30 by 30 is to encourage local and state bodies to adopt resolutions opposing not only 30 by 30, but also conservation easements. There's even been a bill introduced in Congress entitled the Landowner Easement Rights Act that would prevent the U.S. Department of Interior from entering into a conservation easement for a term longer than 50 years. Tonight, I call for our community to aggressively push back against any efforts to spread misinformation about private land conservation. We must articulate the value of land trusts' work with local landowners, work that is voluntary, local, community-driven, nonpartisan, charitable, and enduring. We also need to be adept at explaining all the public benefits that this work provides: pure drinking water, healthy food, clean air, carbon sequestration, habitat for wildlife, and places for people to reflect, recreate, hunt, and fish. And we need to be much more assertive that the opportunity to protect land through permanent conservation easements voluntarily granted to land trusts is a fundamental private property right that must not be undermined or abridged. I want to call out a member of our community who has shown how to do this effectively. Dave Sands, Executive Director of the Nebraska Land Trust. When momentum began to build in his state in opposition to 30 by 30, including from the state's governor, Dave did not shy away from the fight. Instead, he rallied farmers and ranchers who had conserved their land to tell their stories about how permanent conservation easements allowed them to decide the future of their land continue their way of life, and stay on the land. The Nebraska Land Trust community wrote op-eds, letters to the editor, they placed stories in local papers, they attended town halls, and they advocated for conservation with government officials. I encourage you all to go to the Nebraska Land Trust website and watch the short film, From the Grass Up. It is one of the best, most succinct and moving testimonials that I've seen about how essential permanent conservation easements are to the protection of the nation's working lands and natural landscapes. My point here is that our professional field, our community of land trusts, our tools of the trade, none of them is immune from today's culture wars. But the network of roots we have laid down mean that we have people we can mobilize to tell stories about the benefits of voluntary private land conservation. We must enter the fray and use those stories to dispel myths and misinformation that put our work at risk. I know that goes against the inclination of many of us to work quietly behind the scenes and let conservation results speak for themselves. But that is not enough in today's world. Please know that the Alliance is producing a toolkit that includes strategies and messages to help all of you and your partners push back forcefully against unwarranted and cynical attacks on voluntary private land conservation and conservation easements. We must resist these assaults on our work and the essential tools of our trade. And we must differentiate and highlight our conservation practices and how they empower private landowners to choose to conserve their land and exercise their private property rights. This brings me to the second call to action I am making tonight, that one of the ways that we can counter polarization, negativity, and misinformation is to take the initiative and engage in positive outreach to the millions of people who are inclined to embrace our work but haven't yet been exposed to it. This spring, the Alliance rolled out our pilot test of our online Gaining Ground marketing campaign. Framed explicitly as a call to action campaign rather than a public awareness campaign, the ultimate success will be that land and water conservation becomes a priority issue of public concern with a commensurate investment of public resources. You can check out the campaign microsite at gaininggroundusa.org, the primary purpose of which is to drive visitors to a land trust near them. We also have a toolbox with messages, graphics, and video assets that you should feel free to use with your own outreach. Let me show you now an early example of a prototype that we've created for the campaign.
We all know that our incredible planet is in trouble. Wildfires, pollution, devastating storms, and poorly planned development threaten the land we love and essential habitats for plants and animals. Fixing it can feel too big for one person, right? Well, maybe not. Because we can all have better lives, stronger communities, and a healthier planet by making sure that our beautiful open spaces stay beautiful and open. That's the power of land trusts. From working ranches to neighborhood parks to vast forests, land trusts partner with landowners to conserve land forever. And when communities come together to support land trusts, their local actions can have global impacts. Every piece of land that we save means less carbon in the air we breathe, healthier soil for our crops, cleaner water from our taps, and more protected habitats for plants and wildlife. And land trusts are working to ensure that everyone has access to natural areas where we can increase our fitness and decrease our stress. Together, we can keep gaining ground. Support a local land trust. Visit gaininggroundusa.org today.
So the campaign pilot this spring was focused on 9 media markets across the country using assets like that, and it offered an opportunity for us to test messaging and strategies and earn media outreach and our ability to reach our targeted audience, which is a group of approximately 33 million young, diverse individuals that we call the conservation concerned. Our market research reveals that these people care deeply about conservation, but they have not yet engaged with land trusts. They are primed to join us under the conservation canopy that we are building. To appeal to this audience, our research shows that we have to talk less about how we work and more about why the work of land trusts matters. Stated another way, rather than positioning the land trust community's core purpose as advancing land conservation in the U.S., we are positioning conservation as an essential way to address the major challenges facing our society. In a nutshell, we are empowering individuals to make a meaningful difference in their communities and the world by supporting land trusts. We learned a lot from the pilot, and it is our intention to move forward with the campaign with a full national launch next year. I want to be clear that this campaign is not just an Alliance initiative. In fact, we could not have designed and launched the pilot without the support of a group of land trusts who have been working with us for almost 2 years. Again, I encourage you to visit gaininggroundusa.org to see how the Alliance, with the support of its partners, is doing so much to make conservation relevant to far more people, and in doing so, generating the political support and resources necessary to achieve our ambition of conserving another 60 million acres this decade. When we launch the campaign nationally next spring, please join us in using the messages and resources to engage new supporters in your communities. I also encourage you and your land trust to take full advantage of the community-centered conservation offerings that will augment the Gaining Ground campaign and ensure that land trusts develop the ability to reach and serve all people. Our Chief Program Officer, Jennifer Miller-Herzog, will describe those programs and services during Saturday morning's plenary. Okay, I'm on to my third and final call to action tonight. And it is for us to continue to exercise our considerable political muscle. The fact is that the last 4 to 5 years have been sort of a golden age for land conservation, as measured by federal policy successes. We saw the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanently authorized with dedicated full funding, a huge investment in conservation through the Great American Outdoors Act, and a strong conservation title in the 2018 Farm Bill. And just this past month, we saw the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Among other things, this historic bill provides nearly $370 billion to battle climate change, including significant funding increases for voluntary private land conservation and natural climate solutions. Specifically, the legislation includes nearly $20 billion for the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which will be allocated over 4 years. This includes $1.4 billion for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, $4.95 billion for the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and $8.45 billion for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Myriad other conservation programs outside of the Farm Bill will also receive billions of dollars in additional funding. That is some serious fertilizer for the conservation canopy that we are growing. Now, this historic level of investment in conservation and the recognition that the land sector can play an essential role in mitigating climate change and its impacts didn't just happen. It is the outcome of years of relentless advocacy by conservation advocates, including many of you, to elevate conservation as a top priority among key policymakers, such as Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, who is the current chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Yes. We now need to influence how this money gets on the ground, including ensuring that federal agency interpretations of the new law advance climate change mitigation without overcomplicating or impeding conservation transactions. And we need to do all we can to ensure that bottlenecks within federal agencies are reduced so that money flows quickly and easily to land transactions that are ready to go. Now, of course, I'd be remiss tonight to not emphasize that we need to exercise our political muscle between now and the end of this year to ensure passage of the Charitable Conservation Easement Program Integrity Act. That legislation will end the scourge of abusive syndicated conservation easement transactions that have damaged the reputation of our field. That bill is now part of the Enhancing American Retirement Now Act, aka the EARN Act, which stands a real chance of passing this year. most likely in the lame duck session this December. This is our best chance to win this essential policy battle, so please take action when the Alliance's government relations team asks you to do something. Finally, it's important for me to note two other policy opportunities on the horizon. First, the Farm Bill is scheduled to be reauthorized next year. It remains the most significant source of funding for voluntary private land conservation. We are exceptionally well positioned and organized through the Farm Bill Working Group to maximize the resources in its conservation title and ensure that its various programs remain workable for landowners and land trusts. Let's seize this incredible opportunity, which could power our field for many years into the future. And speaking of power, Congress is about to engage in a debate about the permitting and siting of energy infrastructure. And there is tremendous pressure building to expedite the build-out of both fossil fuel and renewable energy facilities. There is perhaps no greater development threat coming down the pike than domestic energy production. And we must do everything we can to build a consensus that lands and conservation status must be respected and that we can meet our clean energy goals without taking or developing conservation lands. So notwithstanding all the challenges facing our society today, our field faces a bright future, and we have been handed some amazing opportunities. Our work is more essential than ever, and people are increasingly inclined to hear that message. In order to seize these opportunities and realize our full potential and build the conservation canopy our country needs, I have called tonight for us to do three things in the immediate term. Push back aggressively on disinformation about voluntary private land conservation, bring millions more people into the fold, and exercise our political muscle. The Alliance will continue to offer programs and services to enable the land trust community to do all these things. And I also want to emphasize that the Alliance is taking on another important challenge that individual land trusts cannot, and that is unlocking vast amounts of additional philanthropic funds to power land conservation. The fact is that most conservation transactions include some private land capital. Government funding for conservation, no matter how generous, will never be sufficient. There is no way around the fact that land trusts need more capital from the private sector, including flexible, low-cost interim financing that allows land trusts to seize transactional opportunities when they arise. And it goes without saying that land trusts cannot increase the pace of their conservation work by an order of magnitude without significant additional resources for staffing and operations. You can't be expected to do this level of work without more land acquisition and stewardship staff, not to mention all the other essential functions that make your organizations run. Now, please hear me. It is crucial that I not overpromise on this point, but please know that Alliance staff is engaging in many conversations to unlock new resources for land trusts from private foundations and corporations. And we are also attempting to free up resources to support land trust operations rather than only land capital transactions. So please stay tuned. So in closing tonight, let me repeat the elevator speech that I make to anybody who will listen. For the nation to tackle today's biodiversity, climate change, and other environmental, social, and health crises, it must take full advantage of solutions offered only by the land conservation sector. And the huge number of acres that must be enrolled in this effort cannot be accessed through government-owned lands, both because the current government estate is not large enough and because today's politics preclude that estate from being significantly expanded. The solution must involve the conservation and management of vast amounts of privately owned lands by enabling landowners to do right by their lands, their families, and their communities. And there is no force more capable of making that happen than the land trust community working in partnership with the Land Trust Alliance. I hope you'll join me in spreading that essential message. So let me say thank you again for attending Rally 2022 and for all you do to advance land conservation in America. Together, we will continue to offer tangible, hopeful solutions to the societal challenges facing us today and tomorrow. Together, we will build the inclusive, equitable, and diverse conservation community to which we all aspire. And together, we will create a vast canopy of conserved lands and powerful, effective community organizations that deliver the benefits of conservation to all Americans. Thank you and good night.